if this initiative to get their central banks to club together to create this new, in a sense, digital virtual currency that would be in their reserves really takes off, then I would regard this as actually the biggest attack on the economic power of the US, certainly in our lifetimes.
A lot of people talking about gold at the moment, given how much the price of it has gone up by. And Nikhil Balani has asked a specific one on it. He says, the Bank of England seems to hold billions of pounds worth of gold. Why? Would it ever be used for public spending, for example, in the event of a war or a crisis? Are there any circumstances in which gold would change hands with another national bank? I find gold really fascinating because it feels really old school to talk about these like gold bars that sit in the Bank of England. And, you know, we know that the Bank of England has one of the largest gold vaults in the world. It's just second to the New York Federal Reserve, and it's worth something like £200 billion. But in terms of who owns it, it's not us in the UK that owns all that. We own a little bit of it, but actually a lot of it belongs to other countries. So I think we hold gold for something like 30 different countries and also some businesses as well. So this massive vault full of these gold bars is sitting in our country, but belongs to people all over the world, which is fascinating.
So look, this takes us back into history. Gold, actually, for hundreds and thousands of years, has been the main, what's called store of value in our civilizations. And central banks like the Bank of England traditionally, we're going back hundreds of years, held gold because gold was either the currency for a period or when they started to issue notes, the value of that note was backed by the holdings of gold in the vaults of the Bank of England. It's called the gold, if you remember, we used to be on something called the gold standard, and it was regarded by central banks as important to back their currencies with gold as a bulwark against degradation of the currency, which is another word for saying it's a bulwark against inflation. And then the nature of central banking changed in the Great Depression, and central bank after central bank disconnected the value, because in the old days, you used to be able to go to the Bank of England with a £5 note and say, I want £5 worth of gold. You can't do that anymore. That ended about 100 years ago. Now, that's the history of why central banks have gold in their vaults. The reason they continue to have reserves of gold is because they never know what resources they will need in a crisis. So banks, central banks, have diverse reserves. But the two most important chunks of assets that they own dollars, the world's so-called reserve currency, the most important currency in the world, the US dollar, and they hold gold. And they hold these assets, these reserves. So, for example, when a currency massively comes under pressure, sometimes the central bank feels, for reasons of monetary stability, that they want to prop up the currency. Yeah, they want to buy their own currency. In order to prop up their currency, they've got to have some asset to sell in order to buy back their own currency. So I don't know if you remember, but when George Soros piled into dumping sterling in 1992, the infamous, the notorious Black Wednesday, the Bank of England sold an enormous amount of gold to buy sterling, right? And so it's in crises like that that central banks hold a whole variety of different reserves as a so-called store of value. The most important chunk for all central banks is the US dollar, but the other kind of asset they hold is gold.
Interestingly as well, have you seen that for the last year, Costco has been selling gold bars, so you can buy a 1 ounce bar, 28 grams in new money, made of kind of nearly pure 24 karat gold for $2,700, and they have been flying out the door. So I think Wells Fargo estimate that they're selling something like $100 million worth of these gold bars every single month. And every time a shop gets them, they sell out straight away. And now you can actually only buy them online. So there's this weird fascination from people about consumers themselves owning these gold bars, although who has $2,700 in their back pocket to go and buy an ounce of gold? I don't know. But there's people out there doing that in their droves, which is interesting from an investment point of view as well. But you were saying there about how gold has been seen as this kind of safe haven. And when there's uncertainty, that's often when the value of gold goes up because more people put their money in that. So whether it's geopolitics or the US election and what might happen there, or interest rate cuts, that type of thing, you'll see the price of gold go up. But you remember we had Mohammed El-Erian on the programme last week, and he's done a really interesting piece in the Financial Times about this, saying, actually, if you look at the price of gold over the last year, it's just been rocketing up despite kind of ups and downs of geopolitics or financial uncertainty. And he's saying it looks like it's less about following this money into the safe haven, and that's why gold's going up. But actually, it's about people looking for alternatives to what you've just explained, which is this dollar-based system. That's kind of been the core of what he describes as our international architecture for 80 years now. He's saying, actually, this is about taking the power away from dollar and the dollar-based payment system being the core of what the world global economy is built on. And there was some really interesting stuff that's come out of this BRICS meeting with Putin as well, Robert, isn't there? Do you want to tell us about that?
So you're absolutely right that one of the most fascinating aspects of the fact that central banks are buying gold is the way that it reflects the massive modifications that we're seeing to globalization as a result of the creation of two competing power groups, one around newer economies, China and India on the one hand, and, that are now much, much more consciously resentful of the economic as well as military power of the United States. And we also have in the United States both one candidate, Donald Trump, who is explicitly in favor of rolling back free trade and much of the trends of globalization with these enormous rises in tariffs that he's talking about. But even his opponent, Kamala Harris, is talking about putting more tariffs, for example, on Chinese exports. And so this reinforces a trend we've been seeing, which is to an extent a rolling back of financial globalization. Now, there is also this terrifying stuff that's been going on around the expansionist ambitions in a military sense of Vladimir Putin. And he is hosting this meeting, as you say, of the so-called BRICS. Now, I remember that the BRICS was this concept created by the former Goldman Sachs economist Jim O'Neill, but remind me who they are?
Yeah, so it's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa.
And they've now been joined by a bunch of other countries. I think there are more than 20 countries now attending the BRICS meeting in Russia. Iran is there, for example. And so what you can see in Russia, President Xi, all smiles with Vladimir Putin. You've got Modi of India with Putin. These are the world leaders who say we have a legitimate claim to having way more both political and economic influence. Now, if you're Putin, you've got this specific problem, which is after his invasion of Ukraine, Russia was removed from much of the global payments system because the West wanted to cripple its economy, and also all sorts of sanctions were imposed which were supposed to undermine his ability to, for example, in particular, sell his oil and gas to keep the economy going because, basically the West was engaged in an economic war with him. He has this big plan to get round sanctions and to facilitate way more trade by creating a rival payment system to the dollar-based payments system. One manifestation We've talked about the increase in gold reserves in many central banks because, of course, if you've got gold reserves, you are to an extent decoupled from the dollar. But what they are doing is trying to create, in effect, a new digital currency that would be an amalgam, in a way, of all their currencies. And it would be a new payment mechanism that would allow the likes of Russia and China and India to carry on trade between each other without those transactions having to go through American banks, without it being visible to the American authorities. It would be a decoupling from the dollar. And if this is one of the things they're debating at the moment, if this initiative to get their central banks to club together to create this new, in a sense, digital virtual currency that would be in their reserves really takes off, then I would regard this as actually the biggest attack on the economic power of the US, certainly in our lifetimes. Because one of the reasons why America is such an incredibly, both militarily but also economically powerful nation, is every country in the world is dependent on the dollar. And if these countries succeed in creating a genuine rival to that dollar-based financial system, then actually what is in effect a global subsidy to America that can issue as much debt as it likes, for example, and everybody has to buy it, that gets undermined. And at that point, the kind of deficits that America have been running becomes much less sustainable. So this is a really big challenge. It's a really big challenge to the global world order.
And, just looking at what Putin's saying, they're calling this payment system the BRICS Bridge, aren't they? And they want to get it built within a year. So that's pretty soon. That's not long for anyone who wants to kind of battle against this to do their thing either, which is all very scary.
And just to be clear, some are accusing there's this really secretive, we might talk about it on another occasion, but there's this extraordinary institution called the Bank for International Settlements, and it's known as the Central Bankers Bank. It's in Basel in Switzerland. And in the old days, I used to visit it quite a lot because they are the receptacle of a lot of really incredibly important information about all the banks in the world. They know all sorts of really important secrets, shall we say. It's an extraordinary institution. Anyway, the Bank for International Settlements has actually been working with many of these BRICS countries on a sort of prototype for this new central bank digital reserve currency. And part of the worry, actually, for Western nations is that there weren't enough protections put by the BIS put around the intellectual property in this digital currency. And therefore, essentially, Russia, for example, is now piggybacking on this scheme to create its own digital currency, which is a bit of a worry.
And on that happy note, we should probably wrap things up. Thank you to everyone who sent in questions. Just a reminder, do send us more. restismoney@gmail.com is the email. Robert, has your seat suddenly dropped while you were talking to me? I wish everyone listening to this could suddenly see that. It was as if Putin himself had just taken out his chair and you just suddenly dropped.
Yeah, it's part of, when I was a kid, I would have just been, I was routinely told by my teachers that I was a terrible fidget. Now, of course, I can diagnose myself as having ADHD.